Thank you very much. On tonight's debate, Syria, and 10 months after the start of the Syrian uprising, the words of its embattled president, his denial, his threats, and his defiance. On this evening's debate, we'll have a look at what the 1.5-hour speech tells us about the strength of the regime of Bashar al-Assad, besieged as it is by sanctions from abroad and under continued pressure from within. My guests tonight are Monzer Makous, who is a member of the Syrian National Council and coordinator for its relations with the European Union, Jonathan Paris, who is a Middle East analyst and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council of the United States. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us here in the newsroom. We're also going to be hearing from Andrew Tabler, who is the Next Generation Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and who joins us from Washington, D.C. Good evening. Also by satellite from Brussels, we're joined by Marietje Schaake, who is an MEP deals specifically with Syria. Thanks very much to all my guests. We're going to begin, though, by listening to Bashar al-Assad's speech itself, a speech in which he spoke of the heavy cost of the unrest and accused foreign conspirators of working to destabilize the country.
I address you today after 10 months of difficult conditions affecting our country. These conditions affect all of us together. This, the hardest test of our country, cannot be resolved without our belief in God and our people. Syrians must work to be guided by patriotic principles and look further than their own interests. Our priority now is to regain security, which our country has enjoyed for decades. This can only be achieved by hitting the terrorists with an iron fist. We will not be lenient with those who work with outsiders against our nation and people.
Andrew, my apologies, Jonathan Paris, listening to that speech, and it's been picked over a great deal because it is the first time since June that we've heard anything from the man's mouth itself. What does it tell us about his frame of mind, about where he sees things, and what does it tell us about him today?
Well, it tells us that he is not learning from the reality of facts on the ground. He's not learning that most of his country has turned against him. He's not learning that most of the people will not accept anything other than the Assad family stepping down. He seems to be living in this cocoon that says that everything is fine inside Syria, but for some foreigners, some Westerners, maybe the Arab League, that are fomenting trouble from the outsider. And if we could just stop the outsiders, everything would be perfect. It just simply doesn't comport with the reality on the ground.
Monzer Makous, how does it sound to Syrian ears? You are a member of the Syrian National Council. How will your compatriots in Syria listening to the speech have reacted to it? Does it sound at all credible to people?
Absolutely. Because the Syrian opposition was believing since long time that there's no hope to wait from this regime, absolutely, and even the Arab initiative to find some regulation of the situation, we are believing it will give nothing, but we had to accept and to try to see what will happen. And today, we are sure that this attempt gave nothing, absolutely. Now, we are waiting nothing, absolutely, because since long time also we understood that this regime will do never any type of reform. There's only a small part of the opposition, which is called the national opposition inside Syria. It is not a big group, but they still, let us say, hoping that there could be something. Today, after the failure of the Arab initiative led by the Arab League, there is no absolutely reason to hope anything. Today, we are sure that the solution is to transfer the Syrian file to the United Nations, to the Security Council. There is no hope at all. Otherwise, the other alternative, we will have a civil war in Syria. And it would be very damage for all, not only for Syria, for all the Middle East.
Andrew Tabler in Washington, of course, within all that, there were the denials about what was happening in the country, or indeed who was responsible, denials about what the regime had or hadn't ordered on the part of its security forces. There were threats as well, this talk of an iron fist that opposition would meet with, that terrorists, as he called them, would meet with. But there was also a timetable for reform, this promise of a referendum.
That's right. Assad decided he has in his mind that the way out for this is to continue the security clampdown, which he actually called the Iron Fist, which we've been calling the Iron Fist on the outside now for months, and that the ultimate problem in Syria are just some procedural changes that need to be made, and that it's not the nature of the regime itself, that the nature of the regime can stay, but that you need to continue on with the legal changes which have been made over the last 10 months, and now to deal with the Constitution. There would be a committee that drafts a new Constitution, a referendum that approves it, and then parliamentary elections. But of course, to most Syrians, this must seem baffling because the nature of the regime doesn't change. And two, most importantly, this is not a parliamentary system. It's a presidential system. It's one of the most centralized in the world. How even these changes, even to the Constitution, would change things is beyond comprehension to anybody who knows Syria well.
Maricha Schaake, I'd like also to put that to you. What do you think of this promise of reform, timid as it was, the talk of a referendum, the talk of multi-party elections beyond? Is this anything that you as European politicians put any hope in at all?
Well, we in the European Parliament here in Brussels, the entire European Union, but frankly, the entire international community has already stated repeatedly that Bashar al-Assad has lost his legitimacy. And that also means that his words don't mean much to us. They seem quite delusional. He's not taking any responsibility despite his role as president, who bears ultimate responsibility for all the violence that's happening in Syria. And especially, I think we should really judge Bashar al-Assad and his collaborators based on their actions and not on their words. And if we look at those actions, it's very clear what the goal is. There's incredibly cynical and violent crackdown on citizens, including children. And so I think the words are a representation of someone who is completely out of touch with reality, who is incredibly unable to take any responsibility for his actions. And I think that is very, very cynical, but also very dangerous, because it also underlined that he has no incentive or hasn't shown any motivation of changing these actions, which we've been looking at for months now, and of which the results have been death and torture and incredible disruption.
Well, let's take a moment now to have another listen to what Bashar al-Assad had to say specifically about the possibility of a referendum, specifically about his presidency.
I rule with the will of the people. If I give up power, I will do so with the will of the people too. That's clear.
Jonathan Paris, he says these words even as the uprising continues to be repressed. Just today, 10 people were killed in an eastern city, the eastern city of Deir al-Zor. There is a sort of Orwellian quality to this. The words on one hand, the acts on the other, all the while going alongside and sort of parallel. This is what happens when regimes become disconnected from the people.
Yes, as Andrew Tabler said it so well, he's ruling with an iron fist. And when somebody has to rely only on coercion, it means his time is up. I mean, it's just simply impossible, in my view, for him to carry on with an iron fist without any plausible alternative. And as we've just discussed here in these last 10 minutes, the alternative that he's offering today is not an alternative to the iron fist. So he's going to continue to rule by coercion, and that's going to stimulate more resistance until finally the international community and the internal forces and your group can figure out a way to push him out. There's no other way. He can't stay.
Monzer Marcus, what is the Syrian National Council going to do?
Well, now after being convinced that no other hope could be done by the Arab League now, I said already that the only solution is to transfer the file to the United Nations. I have, well, as it was stated only a few minutes ago, this regime is totally involved in terror, not only 10 months ago, from 10 months ago, but only in the 18th. He is totally involved in corruption. And he has no other choice other to continue until the end. Because if he will return, it means that it's some kind of suicide. It is also suicide for the Syrian revolution. We couldn't imagine for only 1 second that the revolution could stop, because it's also is kind of suicide. No, so if you look to the affair from different sides, you see no other solution other to transfer it to the United Nations.
Andrew Tabler, of course, much hope had been pinned on the Arab League mission. The enthusiasm seems rather to have dimmed. They themselves have come under attack over the last few days in Syria. Their report is due on January 19th. There is a chance, is there not, that this will now simply be returned to the Security Council and that is the best place for it?
Well, we have a report that's due from the Arab League on the 19th, next week. And that report will determine whether Syria is complying with the Arab League Peace Initiative, the protocol, which was signed with the regime, or not. And I think until now we see that they're not going to comply with that. You can just see from the facts on the ground. The question is, what does the Arab League do after that? Do they continue to keep the monitors in the country? If you go to the Security Council now, given Assad's confidence in the speech, it seems like that the Russians have indicated to him that they still have his back, and that any kind of resolution there would be much watered down and would not lead to some sort of protection of civilians, and ultimately lead to a political process where Assad steps aside. So that's a big challenge for Western diplomacy, for Arab diplomacy coming up next week.
Andrew Tabler, indeed, if it does wind up back at the Security Council, should the Arab League mission come back and report that indeed the Assad regime is not complying with its plan and ask the Security Council to intervene, the bloc of Russia remains as strong as ever, $20 billion worth of trade ties. That's not going to change.
Right.
No, it's not.
Andrew's absolutely right. The Russians are going to water it down, just as they did earlier in the year. So we really have to think creatively. I think the French had a very interesting proposal not too long ago, which is to create a humanitarian corridor. And perhaps it should be from Turkey, but perhaps it should be also an additional one from Lebanon. There's no dearth of initiatives that can be taken. I don't think we should lock ourselves into the trap of a Russian veto or threat of veto that dilutes it and that just allows Assad to buy time. He needs to pay a price for killing dozens of people every day. And those are the only the people we know about. There are thousands of people we know who have disappeared in jails, who are unaccounted for. So there has to be more creativity on the international side, and he has to pay a price for this continued iron fist.
Marietje Schaake, what more can the European Union, for instance, do? We're talking about the international community and what it might do to help move this along beyond going to the Security Council itself. Sanctions have been imposed. What do you know about the effect that they're having on the regime from inside? How effective do you believe them to be?
Well, I agree with what's been said previously, that we have to look for unconventional interventions. It's very difficult to see what the impact is of what we've done so far, because to some extent, the statements that have been made from the EU side by Catherine Ashton, the High Representative for the EU Common Foreign Security Policy, have actually not even been implemented yet. So we have to be very wary of our credibility, and I think we still have options that have not been explored. One of them would be to propose a very concrete choice to those families, those elites with a lot of economic power, who actually support al-Assad and who also need to have close ties with the regime, but who also have a serious interest in the relation with the EU and with Turkey for their markets. The EU is the biggest trade partner of Syria, and I think that that is something that we have to leverage, and we have to give a concrete choice to those people with economic power surrounding al-Assad and say that their future can be prosperous, that they can continue their business with the EU if they make a clear choice to step away from this regime. In our previous resolution of the European Parliament, which was very strong in words about the violations of human rights, about the neglect of the dignity of the people and the killing and the torture, that was very strong. But we also made a clear statement that we are willing to establish and continue partnerships with a free Syria when democratic transition is in place. So this relationship of trade should be leveraged to push for an end to the violence and to focus on who can be peeled away from the support circles, both economically and politically, around al-Assad. That would be one unconventional thing that the EU can and should do.
Andrew Tabler in Washington, it seems that that is something that a number of people have been saying for some time, that getting the regime in its pocket is one of the best ways of ensuring that those pockets of support that Bashar al-Assad undoubtedly has in Damascus, in Aleppo, amongst the business classes in Syria, begins to ebb away.
That's right, and it's also the primary area where the West has, most importantly, leverage. The EU is Syria's biggest trading partner. The regime's been hit very heavily by oil sanctions, which were put into place by the United States and the EU this last autumn. So also Syrians, and I would say from my experience in Syria, are primarily monetarily driven. They're not primarily ideological. They do have a lot of affinity for their sect. That's true in Syria as a whole. So this is an area, but you know, this highlights the fact that these sanctions are going to have to be used as part of the political process to get rid of Bashar. There could be military, humanitarian kind of interventions in the future. But there has to be a political process to this, and sanctions are a good way to try and get the Syrian elite to break ranks with Assad. And we're going to have to do that and help the Syrian people do that in order for Assad to truly step aside and to lead to some sort of peaceful democratic change in Syria.
Monzer Marcus, what does the Syrian, what news is your opposition grouping getting about the effect that sanctions are having on those pockets of support that Bashar al-Assad has?
Yes, they are all useful, but they are all not enough. We have to make a combination of different processes to be involved in this cause. I would like to make a small comment around the Russian position. We know very well, until now, it was really very strong, and it was supporting totally the Syrian regime. I suggest there could be some changes in the future in Russian position because when we see the instances of the revolution, they will realize that it is impossible to continue with this, and they have to look forward to their interest in the future Syria. This one. The other thing, the most important, it was disclosed recently because we saw last 2 weeks that the Russian opposition is getting very strongly on that scene. And I am sure that the opposition in Russia today, particularly related to Mr. Putin, is so high. And it should be a new factor in the scene. And the Russian government has no choice other to look before to its own problem inside.
Then that's a point that we'll come back to in just a moment. We're going to take a short break now, but do stay with us for the second part of the debate in just a moment.